Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am indeed Robert Ainsley. I'm the head of music and the chorus master here at Minnesota Opera, and I'm joined tonight by the lovely Shannon Trickett, who is in our esteemed resident artist program. She'll be assisting me in this little discussion. And I'm now very pleased to say that I'm a permanent resident of this fine state and these lovely Twin Cities. I've just moved to Minneapolis. And you might remember that I began my time here in Minnesota last year, at the beginning of last season, with another piece by Giacomo Puccini, and that was Manon Lescaut, which was his third work and the piece that launched him to international fame, fortune, and success. And now we're discussing The Girl of the Golden West, La Fanciulla del West, which is from the other end of his career. So where does it appear in his output? Well, he just finished his big trilogy, the big three, La Bohème, Tosca, Madama Butterfly. And this was written at a very difficult period in his life. His wife, Elvira, was notoriously jealous. She was a terrible, terrible worrier about whether he was having affairs. Now, much of the time he was. But on this particular occasion, she accused his maid, Doria Manfredi, of having an affair with him. And this poor girl, it turned into a huge scandal in their village. And lawsuits, and she eventually committed suicide. And these lawsuits dragged on for a long, long time, causing Puccini so much difficulty and pain, and really interrupting the composition of this piece. And you can imagine the sort of pressure he's under by the international community to produce at this point in his life, after three enormous successes like that. So he's very finicky about librettists, and he eventually settles on this tale that's set in the cloudy mountains in California, in the Wild West of America. And he sets about writing it. And I want you to take yourselves back in time to the 10th of December, 1910, and that is the premiere of this work. And the build-up was enormous. This was a real glitzy paparazzi event. So Puccini himself is in New York for the very first world premiere that the Metropolitan Opera Company has ever given. And the cast has every headliner you can think of. It's headed by the legendary Enrico Caruso as Dick Johnson, the romantic lead, the tenor. And he's backed up by Emmy Destin, a very famous soprano whom Puccini had an affair with. And the great Italian baritone Pasquale Amato. And it's conducted by that towering figure, Arturo Toscanini. So he's there, he's in luxury hotels, there are press interviews every day, newspaper articles, he's shuttled from one event to another, and then the curtain goes up. And they've pulled out every stop. So Puccini had requested 11 live horses on stage, he only got 8, it's all they had room for. And in Act 3, in the big chase scene, they had an enormously long painted backdrop of the Wild West, so that when the horses processed along the back of the stage during the chase, it was on rollers, and people at either side did that, so it looked like the whole landscape was moving. So it was a real event. It was as high profile as things ever got at this stage. And the curtain came down after Act 1, and curtain call after curtain call. After every act. It was an enormous success, Fanciulla. So why haven't you heard of it? Well, it never achieved the lasting fame of Bohème and Tosca and Butterfly. But I think that's for quite easy reasons. First of all, we just expect that in a Puccini opera, the leading soprano is going to be victimized horribly throughout the course of the show, and then is going to die some unnecessary and tortured death. Well, here she actually walks off into the sunset, happy with her lover. What's going on, Giacomo, you know? The forces of good and evil that we expect to be so clearly defined are here rather blurred. So the bad guy, the bass baritone, Greer Grimsley, of course, in our production, is the sheriff. And by all accounts, he just does his job and does it rather well in the course of the piece. And the romantic lead is a liar and a cheat from the beginning. He lies to Minnie about his name. It's not Dick Johnson at all. It's the bandit Ramirez. And he runs this group of bandits who are robbing and stealing from all of these miners that we love. And he's not there to fall in love with Minnie in the bar. He's there to steal her gold and all of the miners' gold. So that sort of dichotomy between good and evil is not as clear-cut either. One of the things that audiences struggle with is the fact that it doesn't have the show-stopping big number hits that you're used to. There's no Nessun Dorma, there's no Che gelida manina, no Un bel di vedremo. But all of these things can be viewed as strengths, really. We're not all bad and good. All humans have parts of both. I think this piece probes into psychology in a more real and important way than the other works, which are so clear-cut. The character of Minnie, rather than dying some shameful, horrible death at the end, is a much stronger woman. She's a much better representation of the female gender. And these lack of through-composed arias, there's Che la mi creda in Act 3, is actually because the craftsmanship of the piece is so strong. It functions like a real piece of theatre without this sort of outdated, overblown operatic convention of having to stop and deliver an aria. It's much more like watching real-time movie world. So they're the reasons why it didn't have the same success. But if you're a scholar or a musician or an aficionado, this is the pinnacle of Puccini's craftsmanship. And the musicianship and the techniques that are involved are fascinating. It's one of the most voluptuous and sumptuous scores he penned. So I want to talk to you about the music with Shannon's help, because that's the most amazing thing about this score. So Puccini took the torch of Italian opera from Verdi and he carried it forward. And there were tons of contemporaries in what we call the Verismo school. There was Mascagni, there was Giordano, there was Leoncavallo. And they've written pieces you've heard of, like Cavalleria Rusticana and Pagliacci and Andrea Chenier. But they only have sort of one hit, whereas Puccini has many. Now, why did he last? I think the reason is that Puccini was capable of absorbing other influences in his music. In 1910, it's a funny time in world history and in musical history. And he's listening to Stravinsky's rhythms. He's listening to the sound world and the harmonies of Debussy, the techniques of Richard Wagner and Strauss. And yet he's staying true to his Italian heritage. And it's because he can do all of this and absorb these modern techniques that he's so universal and so beloved these days. So let's talk about some of those techniques. Well, one of the first and one of the best to spot is something that Richard Wagner sort of instigated, and that's the idea of the leitmotif, which for you is just a sort of small musical snippet that can represent either a character or an object or an emotion. But the thing about these little themes that you can spot is that they can transform given the circumstances under which the character or the object or the emotion is. So, for example, near the top of the opera, you'll hear this theme connected to the love of gold. It's very James Bond. You know, you can imagine Shirley Bassey. Slightly dissonant, because gold can poison our minds, this need for gold. But when Minnie and Johnson are discussing the fact that the miner's gold is kept in the bar and they watch after it one after one, that theme overlaps, but in a much more romantic way, because they're flirting over the idea of gold. And it sounds like this. Transformation of the gold theme. There's another theme that's associated with the miners and the fact that the miners love to gamble. It's got a lot of energy. You'll hear that near the beginning. And sometimes when they get quite jovial, it'll get dotted. And when Minnie remembers her parents gambling later in the show, it comes just on the solo violin, quietly, like a recollection from the past. And in Act 3, when they're lynching Johnson, it suddenly becomes a funeral march. It's amazing what these themes can do. And of course, the characters have them as well. So the pseudonym of Dick Johnson, because he's actually the bandit Ramirez, has this sort of swaggery, masculine theme in the brass. And when he reveals his name later, you'll hear that exact theme, but inside the orchestra. And Minnie has a similar theme to Dick Johnson's. It's in the same key, because they're lovers, they're going to fall in love. It's similarly strong, because she's a bit of a tomboy, this Wild West girl in the bar. But it's rounder and more feminine, more romantic. She sure has swagger, this Stetson-wearing girl. And of course, when she gallops on at the end of the show to save Johnson, we get that same theme, but with a bit of gallop and a bit of excitement within it. So the same theme under much more excited circumstances. So these themes are a new way of tying together the score into a musical whole, rather than having to use set-piece arias and structures and sonata forms and da capos. And this opens up this world into much more like a movie, a straight play. Now, something that you would have thought operatic composers would have used much earlier is the idea of program music. And that's music that's meant to sound or even look like what's occurring on stage. Seems like an obvious concept, doesn't it? Well, it took them a long time to get round to doing this. It was actually Beethoven with the Pastoral Symphony, sort of storm music. And then Berlioz with the Symphonie Fantastique is credited with inventing program music. And you'll get some really good examples. So when the mailman comes on, he's in a rickety old coach, and he's got a little horn, which he's tooting, and you can hear that. You can almost see his little carriage coming over the rocks with his little horn. And there were wonderful snowstorms and gusts of wind. And little blizzards and flurries. All of this wonderful program music that we call it. So Shannon's going to sing you an extract now, and it's one of Minnie's arias called Laggiù nel Soledad from the beginning of the opera. And Minnie's telling a story, she's recounting her early childhood in this smoky little room in Soledad, which is in Mexico, sort of in the desert. So you'll hear him evoke Mexico with these sort of exotic fifths. And you'll hear the gambling theme, where she talks about them gambling, that I discussed a little early. You'll hear her hiding underneath the table. Because she's waiting for a single coin to drop down that she can pick up. And you'll hear the coin. That's program music, those program elements. And then, of course, it opens up into a grand Puccini climax that only he can write. So this is Laggiù nel Soledad, where she's talking about her fond recollections of her dad and her mum. Okay. Brava! And that's where we discover what Minnie's need is. And she wants a lover. She wants a relationship just like her dad and her mum had. So that program music is a technique that he got from Strauss and Berlioz. He's listening both to France and Germany there. Now, one of the criticisms leveled at this score near the beginning was how successful Puccini was in writing an American opera. Now, this was not an easy task because he had no precedent. All of that, didn't exist here. All of those westerns hadn't been written. Copland hadn't written his Appalachian Spring. Bernstein hadn't written his West Side Story Dancers. All of that cultural heritage that we take for granted didn't exist. What was American music? Well, he could listen to some of the forms of music that were starting to appear down in the South. Blues, jazz, those rhythms. He picked rhythms from Stravinsky, these modern, funky little rhythms that could appear, say, in the Break's Progress. And by combining these bluesy thirds with these rhythms, we get something that is clearly the Wild West. But there were no Wild West films yet. Puccini invented it. American enough for you? Wild West enough? He is one of the bigwigs in Wells Fargo, Ashby, arriving. Clearly American music, and yet that could also be Stravinsky, this rhythm. It's a very modern sort of sounding rhythm. And there are moments that are almost directly lifted, you can hear. Here's a famous African-American composer of the day, and this is one of his most well-known pieces. Now, that, of course, is the Maple Leaf Rag by Scott Joplin. But this, in the mail scene, where they're reading the mail, these rhythms are rag rhythms. And listen to this. So bluesy, so ragtime music that he's drawing on at this point to make his case. And sometimes you won't notice it. So there are chords in one of Minnie's aria at the end that are so bluesy and jazz influenced that they'd be at home in some smoky cocktail jazz nightclub. Listen to this. It gets better. Amazingly bluesy, modern-sounding music. Of course, he closes it with this gorgeous Italianate Puccini melody, so you don't even notice that it's happening. And this little extract, she'll now sing the voice part over it, is where Minnie is pleading with all of the minors, one after the other, that you can't kill the man that I'm in love with. Think about everything that I've done for you. She goes to one after the other in turn, to Joe and to Harry and to Sonora. So this is Shannon Trickett again. This is the Act 3 snippet of the aria. Beautiful, beautiful, thank you. So there you are, and you think you're listening to Italian opera, and you're actually listening to jazz. Amazing how he manages that. But there's one, I think, incredibly strong influence that I want to discuss as well. And that's the influence of the Impressionists, and that would be Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. And one of the things they did was use, instead of major and minor scales, which most of Western music have been based on, is they used whole tone scales. Much more nebulous, because there's no pattern of whole and half steps. It's all whole steps. You don't know where the beginning and the end is, you know? And if you miss some notes out, you get what we call augmented chords. Again, very sort of otherworldly. And you get pieces of music like this. This is L'Île Joyeuse, one of Debussy's solo piano pieces. So he's using those whole tone scales and those augmented chords. And if I play you the overture of this piece, you'll see just how similar the sound world is. Same thing again, all of these augmented chords. And if I play you the beginning of Act 2, it's all the same techniques. Whole tone scales and augmented chords. But it goes further. So here's Minnie's theme again. And here is the end of that same Debussy piano piece, L'Île Joyeuse. You can see it's exactly the same sort of sonorities and sound world that he's using. So here's another little snippet, another little extract. The Bible scene. So Minnie sings the Bible scene, and we get what we call parallel chords. And here's a Debussy piano prelude again. The same parallel sets of chords. Now, I'm going to have Shannon over here sing you a little extract from the top of Act 2, and this is where Minnie is getting dressed because Johnson is coming to visit her cabin. And she's thinking about what she's going to wear. She wants to look just like she did when they met on the road to Monterey. And then she talks about putting a scent on. And when she talks about the scent, there's this extraordinary effect in the orchestra where all of the strings are playing harmonics and ponticello tremolos. It's a bizarre, wild orchestral effect with those same parallel chords from Debussy, and it almost sounds like you can smell the perfume. Now, I can't imitate it on the piano, but you'll hear the Debussy sound world. You really will. So this is Voglio vestirmi tutta from the beginning of Act 2. I think you'll hear some of those whole tone scales as well. Beautiful, Shannon. Thank you. So I think you can see that Debussy is a major influence on this score. And these techniques, all of these ideas, and many others, are one of the reasons that Puccini is such an international and beloved composer. But he was not only influenced, of course, he influenced as well. And one of the notorious things about this score is that Puccini's estate filed a lawsuit against a certain Mr. Andrew Lloyd Webber for a certain tenor aria, Quello che tacete, sounding, you won't be the first to think that you might be listening to the music of the night. But I think Puccini finishes the phrase much better. could almost be direct quotation, couldn't it? Well, you've got to get your good ideas somewhere. Handel was no better for quotations like that. So it really is. It is the pinnacle of Puccini's craftsmanship, and it's a glorious score, not only sonically, but visually as well. We have some gorgeous sets for you and some stunning singers. It's Puccini at the height of his powers, at the height of his craftsmanship, with all of this to listen to, and you're in for a wonderful ride. So enjoy the opera, and please join me in thanking Shannon for all of her beautiful singing.